So this is our last video in today's lecture, and where we ended last time was talking about lipids. So lipids, again, an organic compound made up of tons of carbon. And we learned about some of the different functions of lipids. So now we're going to go into the structure. Now we are not going to talk about the monomers and polymers of lipids, but we are going to talk about some other very key points in the lipid structure. So the first one, which may be kind of obvious and you already knew, but just to tell everyone, at room temperature, so what it is right now or in the classroom, fats are solids. So here you can see this butter. This butter is a fat, and at room temperature, it's solid. Whereas oils, so here we have olive oil, vegetable oil, peanut oil, any kind of oil, which is a lipid, is a liquid at room temperature. Now, if you were to heat these up or cool them down, sure, they would change, but at room temperature. So saturated fats are solids. So things like butter, Crisco, lard, blubber, all of those are solid at room temperature, and those are saturated fats. So saturated fats are saturated or full of hydrogen atoms. So every single carbon has as many hydrogen atoms as possible. So here's an example. What you'll notice is that each of these carbons only form single bonds with other carbons. So you can see here's a carbon. Remember that carbon has 4 bonds, so it can bond with 4 other things. So here this carbon is bonding once with this carbon, and then bonding 3 times with 3 different hydrogens. The carbon here in the middle is bonding to 2 different carbons, but only single bonds, and it's bonding to this hydrogen. Now you're not going to need to be able to draw something like this, but what you should note is here we have this really nice chain. It's very linear. It kind of reminds me of cellulose, where cellulose was very linear and you could create sheets of cellulose to make a cell wall. Almost the same thing with these saturated fats. They're really linear. You can stack them really easily. So that's why these compounds, these saturated fats, are solids, because they can stack in right next to each other really easily. So this may have you kind of confused, but let's talk about unsaturated fats. Now, something I do want to note before talking about that is that something you should take note of is that saturated fats are not that great for you. So thinking about, say, butter. Butter is really not that great. One of the reasons why is it causes higher levels of cholesterol. Now we know cholesterol can be good. It's used in our cell membranes to make them more fluid, and it's the base of a lot of our hormones. But if we get too much cholesterol, that can cause health problems for us. So saturated fats are going to increase the amount of cholesterol in our body. Now, unsaturated fats are our oils, those substances or those lipids that are liquids at room temperature. So here's a very similar molecule that I showed you when talking about saturated fats. But here you notice a difference. This molecule is not holding as many hydrogen atoms as it could. Look here. We have a double bond between these 2 carbons. Now each carbon is still bonding 4 times. So this carbon is bonding once here, again here, and then twice here. There's still 4 sticks or 4 bonds leaving carbon. But it's not full up with hydrogens. If this was a saturated fat, we wouldn't have this, and each of these carbons would be bound to hydrogen. That's a saturated fat because that molecule is holding the most amount of hydrogens as possible. However, this isn't. Unsaturated fats are not saturated. They are not holding as much hydrogen as they could be. Now look at this structure. What do you notice? It's no longer straight. you can't pack these in as tightly as you can our saturated fats. We now have a kink in them, a bend in them, so they don't get this nice stacking structure. So now they're kind of more fluid. They're hitting each other and they're not making this nice block form. That's why unsaturated fats are the oils, because they can't stack in nice and neatly. Now, unsaturated fats could have one double bond, they could have 2 or 3 or 4 double bonds. The point is they have double bonds. It doesn't matter how many. If they have a double bond, that makes it an unsaturated fat. Now, there's really no negative health repercussions of unsaturated fats. Sure, you shouldn't drink vegetable oil in a cup every day, but they're a lot healthier than, say, our saturated fats because they're not really linked to excessive cholesterol. So here is just demonstrating these kinds of fats. So here on the left-hand side is our saturated fat, and notice each of these lipid chains don't have any double bonds. They're nice, they're linear, they pack in really tightly, and since they can pack in together, that's going to make a solid. But here we have our unsaturated fats. You see double bonds, which are going to cause all of these bends in these lipids. These bends make it so that these compounds can't really, form these really nice backbones, these really nice crystal structures, these really solid structures. So they're more loose, they're flowing more, which is why unsaturated fats are liquids. Now, you may have heard these if you've looked at food labels, not necessarily the nutrition label, but just looking at the front advertisements for a food product. A lot of them will say no trans fats, because trans fats are kind of regarded as a negative thing, and they are, and we'll talk about why here in a second. So what trans fats are is we take a plant oil. So let's take olive oil. Since it's an oil, we know it's unsaturated. It has some of those double bonds in there. It's not holding as much hydrogen as it could be. Well, sometimes we want to make something that is a little more solid. So think about margarine. Margarine isn't butter, and if you've ever had both, you know that. Margarine was actually vegetable oil, but it underwent the process of hydrogenation, so this word right here. Hydrogenation, like the name kind of suggests, deals with hydrogen. That means hydrogen was added to these unsaturated fats. It wasn't holding as many fats or as many hydrogens before, so scientists are throwing a whole bunch of hydrogen at it, trying to add hydrogen to it to make it a saturated fat. Now, there's really no reason to go from unsaturated to saturated as far as nutrition-wise. It's all about that consistency. So, maybe we don't want to use butter, we want to use margarine, or we want to use something like Crisco. So this diagram is showing here we had vegetable oil, a very unsaturated fat. But we're going to add more and more hydrogen so that we can get a harder substance. But this came from plants. This was an oil at one point. So this is artificial. We won't find margarine coming out of a cow anywhere. You can't churn milk and get margarine. Margarine was created by humans from plant oils, but that wouldn't happen in nature. So the more we hydrogenate something, the more trans fats we're creating, and that's benefiting us, so to speak, by creating these harder plant oils. But as I mentioned, these really aren't that healthy. They're not good for you. That's why you see a lot of packaging that markets itself as not having any trans fats. So some of the health risks associated with trans fats is increased risk of heart disease, increased risk of stroke, of type 2 diabetes, because these just don't do very well in our arteries and in our body. So this image is showing all three of those fats. So here's our saturated fats, very nice, linear. You can package them up so you're going to have a nice solid. We have our unsaturated fats that are going to have these kinks in them because they don't have as many hydrogens as possible. They have these double bonds, and these kinks prevent them from being able to package up really tightly. So this is why unsaturated fats are oils. Now, trans fats were unsaturated at some point. They still have this double bond, which you see here in blue, but now it's kind of rearranged. So yeah, there's still a kink, there's still a bend in it, but it's not as bendy as an unsaturated fat. It's straighter like a saturated fat. So these can pack in a little bit more. They're still a little loose. That's why margarine is softer than butter, even though they're both solids. Is because these trans fats make them a little bit looser because you can't pack as tightly as you can a saturated fat. The last fat we'll talk about, we're not going to talk about their structure. We're just going to talk about them. So you may have heard of omega-3s or omega-3 fatty acids. So this is another good fat. So unsaturated fats are good and omega-3 fatty acids are good. Remember that. Also remember that saturated and trans fats are not good for you. So omega-3 fatty acids can actually help to decrease cholesterol levels. So this is really good if you have high cholesterol. And it can help prevent heart disease. So you can find these omega-3 fatty acids in quite a few things, and some things you may not have even expected. So they're found in specific fish, so cold water fish. If you recall when we talked about overfishing, I talked about menhaden. Menhaden's where we get all of our fish oil from. Fish oil are jam-packed with omega-3 fatty acids. Nuts, seeds, some vegetable oils also have omega-3 fatty acids. So these are great sources of a good fat for you. A lot of older people will take fish oil because typically the older you get, the more susceptible you are to increased cholesterol and higher heart disease. That fish oil, what's in it that is going to reduce these risks is these omega-3 fatty acids. So with that, that was the last slide in this lecture. Please review these notes. Treat this as an actual lecture that we did in the classroom. If you have any questions at any point, please send me an email. Especially do this before Tuesday. So send me an email, write down any notes you have, because I want to make sure that you understand this material. So with that, I hope you guys have a great weekend, and I'll see you hopefully in class on Tuesday.